Thank you for listening to the Conform to Christ podcast, where we seek to engage the mind, affect the heart, and call people to follow Christ. Jay Jones, and I'm here with George Mays for a text-driven Tuesday. Good morning.
Good morning.
If you're new listening, or maybe you've been listening for a while, can always give us some help by subscribing, or sharing the podcast with your friends and family. I would encourage you to do that to help us to reach more people with the podcast. So how's it going?
It's good.
You're back in the saddle again.
I'm back.
You play that song?
I'm back.
You play that song?
No, I did not.
How about Back in Black?
No.
No?
No.
Okay, you're disappointing me. You're disappointing me this morning, George.
Sorry.
George is back
I hear
preaching
that a lot.
in Hebrews. So we're back in Hebrews. So if you have a Bible, you'll want to grab that and go to Hebrews chapter 13 this morning. And
This is it. We're on
this is the final stretch.
This is it. Yep.
5 more to go.
Can see the finish line.
5 more to go. You're going to finish. When are you going to finish? December, first week of December?
First Sunday in December.
Yeah.
Then I guess I'll, I don't know.
Will it be a sad time for you?
Retire?
Will be a sad time for you, won't it?
Do I have enough saved up to retire after this day?
I don't know. You maybe. Hebrews is George's favorite book in the Bible. What does one do when he finishes his favorite book in the Bible, George? You just know. Like I just preached expositionally through the whole book of Hebrews. And when am I going to do it again?
Well, that's right.
When am I going to do this again?
I was telling you last week that I was listening to a Greek scholar, David Allen Black, and he's written a book on the.
Does he have a country album?
I don't know. That is a very.
That sounds like a country singer.
He has a book on the authorship of Hebrews,
Mm-hmm.
where he argues for Paul.
Okay.
as the not maybe the person who actually wrote it, but the author.
Right.
And we can distinguish that.
What's the word for that?
Amanuensis.
Amanuensis. Let's call it a fancy secretary.
So he asked, he asked his
fancy secretary,
his class, his first Greek class, I guess, who wrote the book of Romans.
Uh-huh.
And they'll say Paul.
Right.
And he says Paul did not write the book of Romans because he had
a fancy secretary.
He had a fancy secretary. Yeah, he had someone who actually wrote it down.
Yeah.
And so he says we don't necessarily know who wrote Hebrews down, but he argues that it's Paul who's the author.
Uh-huh.
And I was telling you last week, I listened to a podcast with him, and I think I'm convinced.
Okay.
I think I'm convinced. So I think I feel like I need to preach the book over again.
So how would knowing that, if it were true, and you found out like with irrefutable evidence that Paul wrote Hebrews, how would that influence your interpretation? Or would it at all?
I mean, it's not going to really change the interpretation of the book because the book says what the book says.
Yeah.
But I think that doing more maybe systematic theology, it would change a little bit of that, because if you're looking at like Paul's theology of ministry,
yeah,
like we're going to see on Sunday, he talks about remember your leaders
Mm-hmm.
who spoke the word of God to you. Well, you're now going to include that in with Paul's theology of like pastoral ministry.
Right.
You're going to include some of this stuff in with that.
Uh-huh.
Whereas Hebrews has generally in modern times been moved to like the general epistles.
Mm-hmm.
And so here's the theology of the general epistles. Now Hebrews is going to be brought into Pauline theology.
Yeah. So when I learned in seminary and kind of the backgrounds of the New Testament era was whenever things would be written and transported, like they didn't start with, the author's name. So the author's name would be included if it was on a tag.
Mm-hmm.
So this parchment's being shared, there's a tag. And over time, the tags all fell off, obviously.
Mm.
There's something attached onto it.
Yeah.
And so then you don't have that recorded anymore, like it's lost to time. So what you then have is what did the early church say about who are the authors? And we pretty much have that nailed down for all of them except for Hebrews. It's kind of one.
And Hebrews, really, if you look, I think the only other name that is given as a possibility is Barnabas.
Uh,
I think he's the only other name that's given, and the majority say it's Paul.
why
So
don't
Paul wrote 14 letters.
why don't we meet in the middle and say Paul dictated it to Barnabas?
Hey, I can go with that.
There you go.
Yeah.
We just solved it. Right here.
Obviously, we're getting to the end, and we'll get to the final greetings at the end of chapter 13, and the recipients knew who it was.
Mhm.
Whoever it was, I knew who it was. So it wasn't anonymous, and the early church does lean pretty heavily towards it being Paul. They're closer to the source, so
Mhm.
they would know better.
Yeah. Almost like historic premillennialism.
Oh my goodness.
Sorry, I couldn't resist, Giorgio. Could not resist. Let's get back on track. They knew who was writing to them.
Yes, and so the Origin has a quote that is used most often to say, "Well, we just don't know who wrote Hebrews," and Origin wrote, "Only God knows who wrote the book of Hebrews."
Mm-hmm.
And David Allen Black he examines that, and he says that it's a phrase that would refer to the person who actually wrote the book. And then he went to Origin and to Origin's writings, and he saw all the times that Origin references Hebrews, and almost every time he references Hebrews as written by Paul.
Huh.
And so he's not talking about we don't know who the author was. He's talking about we don't know who the fancy secretary
Yeah.
was who
That's right.
actually wrote it down.
Yeah.
Which was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I'm more and more persuaded that it's Paul.
Yeah.
And as you read it, I mean, the theology is it's very much Pauline.
Right.
So
These secretaries had some amazing skills in
yeah.
writing because
Yeah.
they would throw it away if they messed up and they start over.
Yeah.
Talk about the like focus and precision.
Being able to write stuff down as it's being dictated to you.
Yeah. I would never be a fancy secretary. So no one would be able to read it after I got done writing it.
That's true.
I'd be like, what do you mean? It's right there. And they'd be like, we can't. Like, what is that? Is that like a sixth grader? Did they write that? So yeah, I wouldn't fall into that category.
Yeah.
Probably like artists. I could imagine them with their precision writing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all very interesting. So you started us off. You garnered our attention with
I tried to.
John Piper. John Piper quote. John Piper blew the internet up one day.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah. And
do you think that Piper is even on the internet?
You know,
I mean, So this was a tweet.
yeah.
We're still calling them tweets, even though Twitter has been changed to X.
What are you supposed to call them?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't think that name was thought through
I don't
very
know.
well by Elon.
Rebranding. That's a marketing fail, maybe.
Yeah. He tweeted this. I think it was October 1st. Okay. Yeah,
He started the month. He said, "Let's reform worship."
Yeah.
Reformation month. Let's reform worship.
Yeah.
Let's get coffee.
Let's just burn the whole thing down.
Yeah. So he came after the coffee lovers, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. Yeah.
And
he tweeted, "Can we reassess whether Sunday coffee sipping in the sanctuary fits?"
I mean, it's a good drink.
And I mean,
Cream soda is a heavenly drink, so that one would say yes.
Okay.
I would say yes.
Okay.
Coffee is pretty close, but we can have this discussion about it.
Yeah. Well, you know as well as I do the dumpster fire that is Christian Twitter.
Right.
So,
People have strong opinions.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Strong opinions about coffee on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was a mess. Got some good memes out of it, though.
Yeah.
I should have brought in some of those memes this morning. There were some pretty good ones.
So this whole premise kind of is like, can you really offer reverent worship to God if you're like sipping on
Sipping
coffee?
on coffee, yeah.
I will confess that I have been perturbed to see that as some people are caught up in rapturous worship in the congregation, to see others not and sipping coffee while singing is going on.
Yeah, so I can see Piper's point. Like if you're in the middle of singing,
Uh-huh.
if you don't need the coffee, like if you're not like having a coughing fit,
Right.
maybe just put it down
Right.
while we're in the middle of singing,
Uh-huh.
because we're worshiping.
Right.
Um, so I can see his point.
Uh-huh.
Like maybe if you're leaving the church service to go get a refill, like maybe rethink
Yeah.
like your motives. But on the other, having said that, on the other hand, I don't think it's wrong to have a drink in the service.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I typically bring something, especially when I preach. I've
Yeah.
got to have something.
Some
I mean,
water.
I
There's
had
some water up there. Stand by
water. I had tea yesterday in a mug
for your throat. Yeah.
because I was holding in a cough the entire time I was preaching, and I was worried that I was going to have a coughing fit. So I got to have something.
Yeah.
So I'm not faulting anyone for having something to drink. I don't think it matters. Well, with maybe a caveat, I don't think it matters what you're drinking during the service. I don't know. I'm giving people some ideas, but maybe if you're like treating the worship service like a concert
Yeah.
or a picnic,
Huh.
maybe rethink your beverage.
Right. Yeah.
The same with I would say the same with like bringing a snack.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a sin
Mm-hmm.
if you have something that you're. Man, I imagine that while Jesus was teaching, very often people would be sitting around eating and listening.
Yeah.
But if you're, if the pastor is in the middle of preaching and you're like opening a cellophane wrapper, maybe you bring something different.
Right.
Yeah. So I see Piper's side of it. Though I think with Piper, and it's a tweet also. I mean, you're not going to get a whole lot of nuance with a tweet. But with Piper, he can often push a little bit further, maybe than I think he ought to. But maybe that's the point. Maybe that's the point of the tweet is just to get a conversation going and people to be thinking about how they're treating the worship service. Though I did see a meme that said that pastors, what your church needs is not stronger coffee; it's for you to be a better preacher, and that
That's true.
that stings a little bit.
Yeah.
They don't need the coffee to keep them awake. They
don't
need
preach
to
for an hour.
Oh yeah.
Well, you and I are both guilty.
Oh,
of
I
that.
know it.
The last sermon in Jonah I really thought would be short.
Mhm.
This will be 45 minutes.
Mm.
Not my finest hour because it went over an hour.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I was an hour and 1 minute yesterday.
Yeah.
So, but what caught my eye, the reason why I used that is that after he asked that question, he cited Hebrews chapter 12,
Yeah.
verse 28. Let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe.
Uh-huh.
And so he's essentially saying, is drinking coffee in the worship service offering to God acceptable worship, or service is probably a better translation. Acceptable service to God with reverence and awe.
And then you use that to transition to your sermon. You
Yeah,
say
because
that
we're in chapter 13.
Right.
We're 2 verses removed. There's 29 verses in chapter 12, so we're right there. And the question is the author of Hebrews writing about drinking coffee in the worship service when he writes that? Obviously, he's not. But I think that a lot of people they can see this verse, and I think that Piper took the verse out of context, and people can be thinking, well, we need to, in the worship service, have reverence and awe for God, which is true. But is this verse about the worship service? And I would again say no. I think that we can come to Sunday morning worship and we can have reverence for God in our worship, in our singing, in our prayers, and listening to the sermon, and then we can leave and we can still be disobedient to this verse. And so we want to understand what is acceptable worship to God, and my answer is it's chapter 13.
Yes. Yeah. And so there's more.
Right.
It's maybe he's trying to make a modern application, but it was a good opener because you introduced us to what we're going to be talking about in the rest of Hebrews, and that's that's the application of.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. We get to chapter 13, especially after a 5-week break, and then we've got these artificial chapter divisions and section headings that have been put in by not the biblical author that will kind of separate these arguments, and we don't often see where these things fit together. So if you read chapter 13, we'll read it in just a second. It's like a complete change in subject and tone.
Well,
Yeah, I mean it doesn't flow. He says, "For our God is a consuming fire." That's verse 29 of chapter 12, and then he says, "Let brotherly love continue."
right.
And I was like, okay, that's a shift. It's such a shift that some more liberal scholars have actually said this is not the same author.
Right.
Like this is a tag on.
Yeah.
And I was going to include this in the sermon. It's in my notes, but I just didn't have time, and I thought this would be more podcast material than Sunday morning sermon material. It's funny because some of these reasons or the reasoning sound like conspiracy theories, which I know you're a big conspiracy theory guy.
Yeah.
So I thought there were
yeah.
like there's various theories, and again this is more liberal scholars like to say, well, this chapter 13 doesn't really fit with the rest of the book, and so they think, well, that someone else had to have written this. Some think that maybe someone trying to mimic the Apostle Paul wrote chapter 13 in an effort to gain more acceptance. So the book is anonymous, and this person trying to make sure that it has proper authority, it gets circulated among the churches, tries to mimic Paul's style in chapter 13 with how he ends his books. And so we've got, I don't know, kind of a, I don't know, fake Pauline letter being circulated. Some say, well, 13 sounds like Paul because it is written by Paul, but it was part of some other lost Paul letter, and somehow this got stuck onto the end of Hebrews.
Yeah.
It's
very strange.
Like, okay. I mean, the efforts that go into concocting these theories instead of just reading the book as the product of one author is kind of funny.
Yeah.
It's like this end of some other letter got detached from that letter, and somehow it got like
somebody wrote a PhD on this,
like pasted to the end of Hebrews chapter 12, and it just started being circulated and copied.
Somebody wrote a PhD on this with no historical evidence for it, I'm sure. Oh
yeah,
yeah.
It's bizarre, but there really is no reason to say that 13 doesn't fit with the entire book. Leon Morris, who is a conservative scholar, he says there's no linguistic difference, and while the argument is not so tight, it is in the manner of the author. So he says the argument's not as connected, but it's still the same style. Yeah. But I would go a step further, and I would say that this chapter actually is the logical conclusion to everything that the author has said in 1 through 12. So instead of saying that it's the same style and same tone and language as the author of 1 through 12, I would say that the argument is actually really tight.
Right. So you're arguing then that 13 is how do we offer
Yeah, it's
a life of reverent worship?
yeah, it is the necessary conclusion to the theology.
Right.
And that's what we see in all of the New Testament epistles.
Mm-hmm.
This is a shorter. I think we kind of lose sight of that in Hebrews because we've got 12 chapters of theology and just one chapter of application. Whereas you've got like the book of Ephesians, where the first 3 chapters are theology and the last 3 are application.
Right.
But it's the same. It's the same idea. Like the theology is front loaded. But now, based on the theology, how are you supposed to live?
Right.
That's what's going on in chapter 13. He front loads this letter. Well, really, it's really a sermon.
Well, maybe this is the fancy secretary's fault.
Yeah, maybe.
Because in Romans, we have something similar, and it's clear in chapter 12. We're moving now to application. But there's a phrase, I appeal to you, therefore. So, I mean, what if you put, I appeal to you,
there's just
therefore?
there's just not a transition.
Let brotherly love continue.
There.
I'm just having some fun.
Yeah.
But, no, I think you're right.
The
I think
language,
you're right
there are key words found in the 6 verses we looked at that keep drawing us back to things that were written before, and it's not quite as clear in the English, but just studying it in the Greek, you see how he uses some of the same language to draw us back to the rest of the book. And so the point is, theology without application is it's dead.
Right.
Like you're filling your head with all this information, but it doesn't have any effect on your life.
Right.
So Hebrews 13 is there to say, okay, you believe everything that 1 through 12 says. Now you show it by the way that you live.
Yeah. So your thesis statement, or another term for preachers, is your plural noun proposition statement. So we're on Sunday nights, there's some guys trying to learn how to study the Bible and to teach class, or maybe even one day to preach a sermon. And so one of the things that they learned was you should have a proposition statement in your introduction. And so yours was this: 6 loves for Christian living in a hostile culture. And that should correspond with the text. So if you have your Bible and you're going through, you're going to be able to see those, which is also a component of an expositional sermon, is that the points of your sermon should be the points that are clearly discernible in the text to the everyday reader. This is something that we hold to very dearly as people who have benefited from the Reformation. Right? We're in Reformation month, and this is a component of who we are. This is part of our tradition. Our tradition is sola scriptura, so sermons, their points should come from the text of Scripture, and people should be able to see in their own Bibles, which they have in their laps, because people actually bled and died, so you could have a Bible, that what the preacher says should be what God says, and that's it. So I got a question for you before we start.
Sure.
Is it true, George, that the only reason you are preaching Hebrews verse by verse is because you're lazy? Huh? Is it?
No.
Remember, I wonder if I could show this. I bet I could. I bet I could show this real quick. I showed it to the guys last night. Somehow I have 13 mutual friends with this person. No idea how, but I do.
Yeah.
Ted Kim.
Okay.
And he says, George, and you ought to take offense. Can we throw this on the screen? He says, what I notice about expository preachers is that their main and only reason for saying what they say is because the text says so, which is weak and insufficient. And then he goes on to say, expository preaching can be a lazy preacher's excuse for saying what they say because today's text happens to be this passage. So, George, is it true? I'm cross-examining you.
Yeah.
That you're just a lazy preacher. And so all 6 of these points They're really just that.
That's right. I'm just being lazy. Well, it's like that quote from Andy Stanley. Andy Stanley. You remember that quote from Andy Stanley?
Yeah, I do.
Uh, Guys that preach verse by verse through books of the Bible. That is just cheating. It's cheating because that would be easy.
It's too easy. That's why I never do it. That's what I say
Um,
about dunking, George. That's why I don't dunk. It's not because I can't. It's because it's
Because
too easy.
It's too easy to do it.
So
Yeah.
I just move on.
I mean, you hear quotes like that as an expository preacher, and you think, where's the easy where's the easy part coming from?
Right.
It's not easy. I
No.
I wasn't creative. I wasn't creative with these points. I think that and again, it's not because I'm trying to be lazy. It's because I want the points. I don't want I want I want the people in the pews to be able to see the points.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to make the points so convoluted that they're like, "Hey,"
Right.
like I want them to see it. And so verses 1 through 19 really are the ethical exhortations.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're going to look at them in four parts, just
Okay.
because I mean, there's so much
There's
there.
too many.
I mean, even as
Doing one.
even as I was preaching these 6 verses, I was like, man, I could have split this up even. Um, and I think that you've got six are more of kind of like these general exhortations. Then 7 through 16 are going to be kind of theological, and then 17 through 19 are going to be more, I don't know, ecclesiastical,
Okay.
related like to how you live in the, like, with your leaders,
Yeah.
with your pastors. And then you got the benediction, you got the final greetings. These 6 verses, though, they all had a theme that tied them all together. As I was looking through it, as I was studying, I saw there is this common theme. It's love. It's all about love. And so that's what I went with my 6 points. 6 loves.
Love is love.
6 verses, 6 loves.
Hmm.
No.
Is that not true?
No.
Okay.
No.
That's these 6 might contradict that.
Particular, especially the 4th one.
Right.
Particular ways that the church is called to love in this hostile culture, this climate where they're being persecuted. What kind of people are they supposed to be? They're supposed to be people that that show love, and which is really interesting because Jesus, in Matthew chapter 24, when he's talking about persecution that will arise, he says, because of these tribulations, the love of many will grow cold.
Uh-huh.
Like, he warns that love is actually going to be one of the first things that goes.
Right.
And so what's the thing that the author of Hebrews really hammers home? Love.
The hostile culture. It's like, Jody, you're on deployment. It will steal your love away. You don't want that to happen.
That's right.
Right? You want to be able to live your life offering your life as a sacrifice of reverent worship. So you need to pursue these 6 loves.
Right.
So let's have you read the text.
Okay. All right. Let brotherly love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. Remember those who are in prison as though in prison with them, and those who are mistreated, since you also are in the body. Let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous. Keep your life free from love of money, and be content with what you have, for he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper, I will not fear. What can man do to me?
Awesome. All right, we'll jump in right away. The first love that we must pursue as Christians living in a hostile culture is to love the brethren.
You like that old word?
The
Love the
brethren.
brethren.
Love the brothers.
Yep.
Love the brotherhood.
Yep.
So this is just for the guys or what?
That's right. Yeah, just for the guys. Ladies can check out.
All right, so it says let brotherly love continue.
No,
That's
I mean,
it. That's it.
well,
that's,
I mean,
that's your preaching point.
I mean, that's interesting that you bring that up, but it's it is a catch-all for brothers and sisters.
Mm-hmm.
The ESV goes out of its way to like show that everywhere that it says brothers. There's always a footnote that says, well, this could mean brothers and sisters.
Right.
But I think that even more importantly is that the apostles direct their teachings to the men. Like I don't think we should be ashamed about that, because the men have the responsibility to lead their families.
Right.
Right. And so I don't think that let brotherly love continue means, well, the women don't have to show love towards the brethren. But I do think that there is an important point to address, that the apostolic witness is directed towards the men.
Right. You brought up several verses in support of this. You mentioned in 1 Corinthians 13, you've got this major section. It's all about love and how all things will eventually pass away, but love endures forever.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah,
love.
I mean, there are, I have, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, at least 12
Right.
passages that we could look at
Yeah.
where we are urged over and over and over again to love the believers.
Yeah. So one of the ones you brought up was John 13,
Mm-hmm.
when she says, a new command I give to you, to love one another as I have loved you. You are to love one another. By this, all people will know you are my disciples.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't tell you how many times I've seen that used in our culture as an indictment against Christians as to why people don't accept Christianity,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we bring up the love is love thing, right?
Right.
Love is love.
Mm-hmm.
Who people love, and so you as a Christian should be affirming of everyone
Mm-hmm.
and every situation. And the reason that people aren't drawn to Christianity is because you don't even obey Jesus.
Right.
You don't love everybody in such a way that they would be drawn to Christ.
Right.
But as we've pointed out, I believe before, this teaching that Jesus gives is that the love between Christians
Right.
would be so different from the
Mm-hmm.
rest of the world that the world will be drawn to that.
Yeah.
So it's not about Christian love for everyone universally. It's actually about the Christian's love for other Christians.
And this in the context of the book, again, these they're general, but they are part of this book. They just flow out of the teaching. And so when he says, let brotherly love Philadelphia, when we are to let Philadelphia continue, we've already seen throughout the book, especially in chapter 2, how Christ is our older brother,
mm-hmm.
and he's bringing many sons to glory, and we're his brothers.
Mm-hmm.
Believers are family.
Yeah.
And we belong to one another. So this is language of unity within the church. So this verse is not let universal brotherhood of all mankind, let that love continue. It's let love in the church continue. Controversial verse along those lines, Galatians chapter 6, verse 10. Paul says, so then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are of the household of the faith.
Yeah.
Like, who are we supposed to love?
Right.
Well, we're supposed to love everyone, but we're supposed to especially love believers.
Yeah.
Right. And so where should that love be demonstrated? It should be demonstrated in the church.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not going to love the people in the church, you're not going to love the people out in the community anyway.
Right.
Like if you can't love those that you have the most reason to love, like we are brothers and sisters in Christ. Christ has redeemed us out of the world, and we are now a new humanity. We're a new community. If you can't love the Christian who's sitting next to you in the pew, you're telling me that you're going to love the unbeliever out in the world?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's pretty far-fetched.
Right. And so there's this fits in with, if you're facing persecution in a hostile world, I mean, you need to stick together. There needs
Right.
to
Yeah.
be a special support that you
Mm-hmm.
have for each other, special care and love, even a sharing of, your finances and resources
Yeah.
with other Christians so that they can, if maybe they've lost their family.
Mm.
And so you show them love like you would as if they were your own flesh and blood,
Right.
and you take care of them. And so this is one of the means that we have to help us to persevere. That if the whole world has forsaken me and I've lost everything to follow Christ, well, there's still this group of community where
Right.
I do have I have everything that I need.
Yeah. You have converted to Christianity, and now you're kicked out of the synagogue. Your family disowns you. You're not worshiping the pagan gods, so you can't be a part of a guild, and so you've lost your business. You're losing everything. You're not just on the fringes of society. You're like an outcast. We have each other,
Mhm.
right? Where we are together in this. There's a new community that is made up of the people of God,
Yes.
and that's communicated in places like Ephesians chapter 2, right? Once we were not a people, but now we are a people.
Hmm.
Even though we're cast out by the unbelieving world, we've come together in Christ and we form a new people, a new nation, right?
Yeah.
But the the pressures of persecution could lead you to isolate
Right.
and separate from the church. Like, people know that you go here, and so you just don't go anymore. Well, that's not showing brotherly love. That's not letting brotherly love continue.
Uh-huh.
You want to obey this. I think the very base line is be at the church, like meet with the congregation. Like, you can't let brotherly love continue if you're never around other Christians.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right.
That's interesting. The word continue is the word translated as remain up in chapter 12. So God is going to shake the heavens and the earth, and the things that are shaken are going to pass away, and the things that are unshakable will remain. Let brotherly love remain.
Yeah. All right. And then the second love that we should pursue in a hostile culture is the love of the stranger. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this word that we have here to show love for strangers is hospitality.
Yeah. It's literally the word
Stranger love.
stranger love. Yeah,
Yeah.
love of the stranger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So how might this differ from modern ideas of hospitality culturally?
Well, the hospitality that he's talking about here, in the first century, is you've got traveling believers, and inns were expensive, and they were pretty shady places.
Okay.
They were not really the kind of place that you wanted to frequent.
This is like the
Be
Wild West. This
dangerous.
is like the Wild West.
Yeah, yeah.
You see the scene where you go into, the inn in the Wild West, and
Mhm.
everybody's playing poker, and
Right.
everybody's
Bar fight or
drinking.
something,
There's
yeah.
and there's prostitutes everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, fights are breaking out.
Yeah.
That's your hotel. That's the
Not
inns.
yeah, not really a place that a believer would want to spend the night, right? Especially if someone found out that you were a believer,
Yeah,
that's going to add another layer of danger
right.
to it. So these believers, they depended on the hospitality of other believers. You can see this throughout the book of Acts. Acts chapter 10, Peter's at the house of Simon the tanner. He's staying there. That's not his house. That's Simon's house. So Simon is hosting him. Paul goes to Philippi, and there's Lydia,
Mm-hmm.
right? And Lydia's converted, and she invites them to her home. Right? Stay at my house. And you see this over and over and over again. Like whenever they go to a new city, they are hosted by somebody,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that's what's going on here. Like itinerant preachers would need to be um, hosted by somebody wherever they went.
Mm-hmm.
So third John, the Apostle John, he actually praises probably the elder of the church, Gaius, for showing hospitality to these itinerant preachers who have given up everything for the sake of the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
So it's good for you to host these people, to show hospitality to them and send them on their way with whatever they need.
Mm.
So that's what's going on. Showing hospitality is one of the requirements for an overseer in 1 Timothy chapter 3. Interesting in 1 Timothy also, where Paul's giving instructions for the church to support widows.
Mm-hmm.
They're enrolled. There's a list of widows that the church is supporting. They can be enrolled if they've shown hospitality.
Huh.
So that was an interesting
Yeah.
qualification there. I think that hospitality might have also included taking in these wives and children of other believers that have been thrown in the prison.
Mm-hmm.
Again, we're talking about the first century where the wife can't just go out and get a job, right? If the husband is incapacitated in some way, then the family is going to be left destitute.
Right.
If they are in prison for being a Christian, what happens to their family?
Mm.
Well, the church should show hospitality,
Yeah.
right, and
Yeah.
and bring them in. But this is a dangerous practice. This is a risky practice for Christians, because if the apostles are instructing the churches to show hospitality, and Paul and Peter and John, all three of them, are urging the Christians to show hospitality, this would have been very attractive for false teachers.
Uh-huh.
Because some things never change. The false teachers today are all about getting money.
Yeah.
False teachers back then would have been all about getting money too.
Mm-hmm.
And so these false teachers would have been traveling around looking for free room and board. So what are you supposed to do with that? And imagine if you've invited someone into your home. They are a traveling preacher, and they've come to your church, and they need a place to stay, and you host them, and it turns out that they're, I don't know, an Aryan. You might feel a little burned by that. Like they're just trying to, they stay for a month. There's financial pressure there, because hospitality is not just here's a bed, but here we'll provide all of your needs.
Right.
And so it's risky to do that. It also would be risky because you don't know if this person is an informant.
Mm-hmm.
This person could be a spy. You host a church in your home. You welcome the stranger into your home, and they turn out to be a spy for the government. And well, now you put the whole church in danger.
Mm-hmm.
So in this hostile, risky environment, it would be really easy for the churches to just isolate.
Right.
And we don't know you. We don't want anything to do with you.
Mm-hmm.
And instead, the apostles tell the churches to show hospitality.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You had a good quote there from F.S. Bruce. To see if you could read that.
Those who are given to hospitality find that such happy experiences far outweigh the unhappy ones.
Right. Yeah, I like that. That was good.
Yeah. So they may be burned by a false brother, but the promise is that, and we'll talk about this entertaining angels
Yeah.
That's what Bruce is getting at, is that he's saying that the happy experiences will far outweigh the unhappy ones if you show hospitality.
Yeah, so let's talk about that little phrase there. A little surprising phrase. Some people could have entertained angels unawares. So, how? That's the first question that comes to mind.
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, he's thoroughly steeped in Old Testament. We saw that in chapter 11, right? So he's probably thinking about people like Gideon. You know, the angel of the Lord shows up, and Gideon doesn't know who he is for a moment. Samson's parents. But I mean, the most famous one is Abraham, right? In Genesis chapter 18, 3 men come to Abraham, and he shows hospitality. He makes a meal for them, and it turns out that one of them is God, and there's 2 angels. So that's probably the story that's probably the most likely to be on the reader's minds. But I think that the one that is the most impactful for this context is the angels going to Lot. You've got the angels, they leave Abraham in Genesis chapter 18, and they go to Sodom, and they're just going to stay out in the courtyard, right in the city square for the night.
Yeah.
And Lot urges them, don't stay out
it's dangerous
in the city square. Think about this. He doesn't know that they're angels.
Right. He doesn't know who they are.
They are strangers, and they could be. I mean, he knows what kind of area he's living in.
Right.
Peter says that his soul was constantly plagued by the wickedness that he saw. He doesn't know who these people are. They could be robbers. They could be murderers. They could be just like the men of Sodom. Right? Yeah. What does he do? In this wicked climate, what does he do? Does he turn a blind eye? Does he hope that someone else will come along and take them in? Does he just pretend like, they'll be fine? I'm sure they'll be fine out in the city square, and just ignore what could happen. He takes them in. He takes these two strangers in and shows them hospitality because he's a righteous man. So he takes them in and shows them hospitality. It turns out that they're angels,
right?
And they end up saving him and his family.
It is interesting to think about that he includes this here. I think it brings up at least the possibility that there are angels that you don't know are angels that look like humans that you may interact with at some time in your life.
Yeah. I don't think that he's necessarily promising that if you show hospitality, you're going to be entertaining divine beings, because the word angel is the same word for messenger. So you might find that you're entertaining true messengers of God, unawares. But I don't think that it's impossible for him to be saying, you might actually be hosting an angel.
Yeah.
Whatever that would look like.
Yeah.
It is interesting to think about, though.
I think I met an angel one time.
You think you met an angel one time?
Yeah. She had blonde hair and blue eyes, and one thing led to another, and we ended up getting married. So
I saw that coming, but it was impossible for me to stop.
Seems I entertain an angel unawares. Her name is Angela. Is it a coincidence? Is it a conspiracy?
Could be.
What does that mean about our kids, though, George? Are they Nephilim? I don't want to think. I don't want to think about that. Yeah, no, it is an interesting scenario. There are people who have been in like. Did I derail you too much? See that right there, George? That's marriage tips. Marriage tips. Yeah. You always got to look for opportunities to compliment your wife. For the young guys, young newly marrieds. But there are people who have had these strange interactions that, like people who have gotten car wrecks in the middle of nowhere.
Mhm.
They're trapped in a vehicle. A man will come along,
Yeah.
comfort them, and even like bring them out of the vehicle.
Mhm.
And then, all the EMTs arrive and the person just disappears. I don't know who it was.
Yeah.
So, I'm not, we should keep in mind that we do live in a supernatural universe.
Right.
Maybe you've interacted before
Yeah.
with, maybe it's part of God's way of testing you to, who knows what it could be.
Right.
But yeah, I just find it a very interesting verse because it
Yeah,
comes
it
out of
is.
nowhere,
Yeah. Right.
Yeah,
it is an interesting verse. I mean, it's tied into the context of the book that they're in this. They're probably in Rome. That's probably who the book is written to. It's debated, but they've experienced persecution in the past. They're starting to experience persecution again. It's starting to ramp up, and he's telling them, "You want to offer acceptable service to God? One of the ways is to show hospitality. Don't become this isolated church. Care for the care for strangers that are claiming to be believers.
yeah.
Like someone shows up to your church on the Lord's Day and that you don't know who they are, but they claim that they're a believer and they're traveling from here to there. Like, open your home to them, show hospitality to them. You don't know. You don't know if you don't know if it's a true believer. You don't know if it's a government spy. He doesn't give these caveats.
Yeah.
Instead, he says it could be an angel.
What if it's an angel auditor?
What if it's
He's-
an angel that's
He's auditing your church.
maybe.
To
I
see
mean,
how
I
hospitable.
mean, you don't know. You don't know. Now, this was a hard one for me to say. All right, how do we kind of cross the cultural gap?
Mhm.
Because our society is not the same. Now, I was talking to Julia, and she said there are we know a church that shows hospitality to like traveling missionaries.
Mhm.
That the missionaries coming through, they'll open their home or
Right.
whatever and show hospitality to them. So it's we can still do things like that. We probably don't experience that as much because we have 5 elders, and so we don't have like itinerant preachers coming through here very often. But if we were to host like a missionary or something, we could show hospitality.
Yeah, especially if they're going to have a longer stay.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. But how do we show hospitality, in our context? And I think that one of the ways we can do it is showing hospitality to our guests that come on Sunday mornings. Like
They're
like there
strangers.
are strangers. They
Mhm.
come. We don't know who these people are. Are we just going to like give them the side eye and go back to our own conversations with the people that we know, or are we going to reach out and show hospitality and make them feel welcome?
Right.
That's one way that we should show hospitality. And we've got some people in our church that are just fantastic at showing hospitality to visitors.
Yeah.
I struggle with that. I struggle with meeting new people.
Yeah. Some people are definitely, they have a gift,
Mhm.
a gift for this type
Yeah.
of thing.
Yeah,
We tried to, recently, we've laid like an elder gauntlet out there.
yeah.
You know what I mean? So all church ends, all the elders will leave,
Mm-hmm.
go to the back. And so hopefully a new person can escape.
Right.
You know what I mean?
There's a
With-
fine line between hospitality and
Yeah.
hostage
In a hostage
situations.
situation, yeah. So hopefully there'll be, someone from the church will be able to talk to everybody before they leave. Doesn't
Mhm.
always happen. Doesn't always work out that way, but
Right.
at least we're giving it a good effort.
Mm-hmm. But I think that even beyond the 4 walls, we can show hospitality by being someone that's just hospitable to strangers. Like we've both known people that have been in the church for decades,
Mm-hmm.
and they're like the grumpiest person that you've ever met. Like that's not showing hospitality.
Yeah.
like to be this unapproachable person.
Mm-hmm.
Like a stranger's not going to come up to you and talk to you because you may bite their head off.
Yeah. Right.
You know, be be a welcoming person. Like
Yeah.
don't be a grumpy, isolated Christian.
Yeah.
Be someone that is approachable and be someone that is willing to approach others.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's going to be a struggle for some people, where it's going to be super easy for others.
Uh-huh.
It's more of a struggle for me. I have a hard time just reaching out to people. It takes an effort for me to do it. And there's other people like Phineas, my 9-year-old. He's like supernatural to go out and talk to people. But just because it's not your strength doesn't mean that, well, I don't have to follow this verse. I can. That's not my gift. Like, still make an effort to just be kind and warm towards people.
Right. Yeah. That's good.
So.
Very good. So the next love that you have is love for the persecuted. And he mentions here people that are in prison.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see again how these kind of are fitting with the whole book. People that are under pressure to leave the faith, many of them will be thrown into jail.
Yeah,
as part of the tactic against Christianity.
Mm-hmm. Well, so, this is one of those verses that can easily be taken out of context and used for why we should just visit prisons.
Right.
That again, that's not to say like prison ministries are good. I think that people that go to the prisons and minister to people in prison are doing well. But this verse in the context of the book is not a proof text for prison ministry in general. It's for believers who have been thrown into prison. We know that because back in chapter 10, verse 34, he's already talked about in the past, you showed compassion for those who were thrown into prison. These are people that have been thrown into prison for their faith.
Yeah. I remember when I first learned, it was such a like a shift when you realize that many of the letters of our Bible are written from prison, and these prisons are not like our prisons. So you get thrown into a prison then or jail, like they're just going to hold you. You're just being held.
You're thrown into a dungeon.
Yeah. So even if you're going to get food or clothing or even clean drinking water. Somebody's got to bring it to you, or you're just going to waste away.
Right.
And hopefully you have a quick trial date, or you're going to die in prison.
Yeah, you die in prison. Then.
Starvation and
they don't care.
And thirst. Yeah. So
it's not innocent until proven guilty. They're going to treat you like you're guilty.
Yeah. And so there is, if you bring and support that person, then you are associated with them, or whatever crime they're associated with, then people will associate you with that.
Yeah, I mean, this guy's in prison for being a Christian, and these people keep bringing him food. They're probably Christians too. Maybe we should follow them and see where they all gather.
Right.
Like it's dangerous.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, for sure. And there's shame involved with it also. I mean, if you are a Christian business person, someone who has means, you're going to be ostracized because you're associating with prisoners. Like you're probably not going to be invited to all the get-togethers, all the parties.
Yeah.
So you're going to, and there's going to be loss of business for you also, probably business and prestige. Because you're associating with people that are in prison.
Yeah.
So it'd be a dangerous thing for you to do.
Right. Yeah.
But he tells them again, remember those who are in prison as though in prison with them. And he says those who are mistreated, which is a word that ties us back up to the end of chapter 11 with these believers who live by faith and they're mistreated. And then he says, since you also are in the body. And this is where I think your authorship is going to influence how you interpret it a little bit. most of the modern translations that I read said that he's talking about you also have a physical body, and so you can imagine what it would be like to be mistreated physically.
That's not how I read that.
And then I look at Calvin and Gill and Matthew Henry, and they all say it could be that, but it's probably more likely the mystical body of the church.
Right.
And if it's Pauline, that is almost exclusively how Paul talks, right? You're in the body.
Right.
He's talking about you're also in the church.
Uh-huh.
So those members of the church that are thrown into prison, remember them as if you're in prison also, because you belong to each other, because you're in the church. And we have instructions from Paul to rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep.
Mhm.
So remember those who are in prison, because they're part of the body. If they're being mistreated, this is anyone else who's suffering for being a Christian, regardless of whether they're in prison or not, whether they've lost, they've been kicked out of their family, or they're being publicly humiliated, or whatever it might look like. Remember them also, since they're part of you. You're part of the body. It's really weird. The modern commentators saying, well, this is talking about how you can imagine what it would be like to, you're in the body. It's just a weird interpretation.
It is, yeah.
I take it as he's talking about you also belong to the church.
Yeah. Well, a lot of modern commentators, they
Well,
They're-
I was wondering. I was like, okay, it's like all the modern commentators. I was like, I wonder what Calvin says,
right.
and then Calvin gives, I think, a better explanation,
Well,
one that fits in with the rest of, I think, New Testament theology.
well, people that aren't modern scholars, right? They really hold to the analogy of faith. They use Scripture to interpret Scripture.
Mhm.
That's their primary means of interpreting. If they want to understand a phrase that they don't understand, the first thing they're going to ask is, how is this phrase used elsewhere in the Bible?
Mm-hmm.
That's the first thing they're going to ask.
Yeah.
Rather than maybe do what a modern interpreter would do, which is isolate the book of Hebrews in pretend it's in a vacuum.
Yeah.
And try to understand Hebrews only within Hebrews itself, and that's it.
Well, it's just such a weird way of saying that, like, you also are in the body. What I read that before I consulted any commentaries, and I interpreted it as
the body of Christ.
the body of Christ.
Right.
Then I read all these commentators, and I'm like, that's so weird. One commentator, I can't remember who it was, they quoted an older commentator who said that while plausible, the interpretation that it's the church, it's utterly impossible or something, and then they just drop it, like they didn't give any reason why. And I looked at the Greek, and there's not really any reason why it couldn't be the church.
Yeah.
Especially how Paul uses that phrase in his letters. So I disagree with the modern commentators. I'll side with Calvin on this one.
Yeah. All right. So love of the brethren, love of strangers, love of the persecuted. Now the fourth is the love of marriage. And the text says, verse 4, let marriage be held in high honor among all. Let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous. So let marriage be held in high honor. Seems it's got an elevated state among.
This is an interesting verse, because there's not an imperative in the Greek.
Mm-hmm.
Honor is just an adjective, and it just says honor marriage.
Mm.
But the honor is not, it's not a verb, it's an adjective. So it's like honorable marriage, and that's the phrase. So the imperative has to be implied. Let marriage be held in honor. So the very first word in the verse is honor. And this is a word that is used of something that is highly prized or valuable. It's used in the Septuagint for precious stones. So let marriage be like like a treasure.
Yeah. Um,
It's interesting. I was talking to my wife yesterday, and she was mentioning how, and she's on a lot of like reformed Facebook pages, so she may see this more than I do. But she said that often it seems like um, singleness has been elevated above marriage. You see a lot of young single Christians who hold off on getting married so that they can, I don't know, have like freedom,
right.
pursue careers.
Hmm.
Um, I don't think that's necessarily what this verse is getting at, but it is interesting to see how singleness seems to keep getting elevated in our culture. Like marriage is not held in high honor in our culture,
Hmm.
and it seems like just kind of eh, small little ways that seems to be creeping into the church.
Hmm.
Like I tell people all the time, like get married young.
Yeah.
Like get married, have kids. Don't wait. Don't wait until you're like in your 30s, late 30s to get married. Like get married young.
Right.
Um, I know you've talked about that with your own kids.
Yeah. Yeah. If if you get married young, you really your identities are formed. You're forming who you really are. Probably between the time you leave your home, go to college, and you're 25. By the time you're 25, 26, you kind of have an identity locked in there, right?
Mm,
But if you get married before that, you're becoming an adult with someone else.
mm,
And so then your identities really are formed together.
yeah,
You don't have these two like radically independent people
right.
who are now trying to come together
Mm,
and to become one together.
yeah,
Um, and of course, in Jesus's time, people would have gotten married young.
right.
They would have.
There's just artificial reasons to not get married. Like get married.
Right.
Like what are you looking for? You're,
People
look, you're
will
looking
list.
you're looking for this mystical the one.
Yeah.
Like you've been influenced by the culture to think that there's like this special somebody that's just going to meet all of your needs. They're just going to be Prince Charming, or they're just going to be the most amazing woman that's ever existed. Like look for a Christian
Uh-huh.
that you can stand and who can stand you, and get married,
Yeah.
and then just love each other as you're called to do in the scriptures, and have kids and spend your life together.
Right. Yep.
I don't know. People make it more difficult than it needs to be, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it seems fairly clear as we keep reading in this verse um, that there's a sexual nature involved here,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
and that needs to be protected. And part of being held in high honor is that kind of marriage purity is honored and kept undefiled.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a warning that God's going to judge the sexually immoral
Yeah.
and the adulterous. And this is so countercultural. Not only is the Christian idea of marriage countercultural, that two people would become one flesh, um, the idea is that they are so united that, again, like who they are as people are tied up with each other. So
Mm.
the idea then that if someone were to become one flesh with someone else, that would be severed. It would be unspeakable,
Mm-hmm.
an unspeakable disaster.
Yeah.
Right. That's if you just read through the Bible, that's the impression.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the dangers, obviously, is sexual sin.
Yeah.
So sexual sin can,
Especially in the Roman culture.
right.
I mean, pretty much everything was.
Well, if this is written to Romans,
Mhm.
right, and that kind of made that case. People don't realize how drastic the Christian theology of marriage and sexuality is, because in that culture, a man has a wife as a Roman, and her sole duty is to provide a child.
Right.
Like so, it's often said that Rome doesn't have an army; Rome is an army,
Mm.
and that's very true. So your duty is to provide a citizen who may end up being a soldier
Right.
or is going to serve in some service to the Roman Empire. And so the woman in that culture, the wife, is really just seen to fulfill that obligation and to kind of keep those Roman bloodlines
Right.
going. And so a man would have multiple body slaves
Yeah.
who were there only for his sexual gratification.
Mm.
And that would be the norm. That would not be abnormal. That would be normal, and something the wife really had nothing to say. She couldn't do anything about it. That's just her life.
Yeah.
And then here comes the Christian apostles, right, saying to love your wife as Christ loves the church, to
Right.
honor her, respect her.
Yeah.
It's completely radical.
Mm-hmm.
And then not only to mix in this other element, you're only to have sex with her.
Right.
That is revolutionary.
Yeah, I liked what Leon Morris said. He said it's one of the unrecognized miracles that Christians were able not only to make this demand but to make it stick.
Yeah.
Like we don't think about the fact that they're speaking into this culture, something that is just unheard of,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
and it actually starts to have an effect.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's really, you just think about how radical. Well, I mean, it's. I mean, we kind of live in it today.
Yeah, we
right?
live in it today. We're making the same claim.
Right. You have temple prostitution, which is like a Las Vegas
Mm-hmm.
of just like sexual depravity. But
Right.
anything you want, anything your appetite desires, you can get,
Yeah.
and you won't be shamed publicly for it.
Right.
It's just completely accepted, like Roman Empire wide, that this is what people
you
engage
can
in.
still. I mean, I don't think that you should, but you can go to Pompeii, the city that was destroyed by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, and there's just like pornographic images on the walls, stuff that I think if we saw it like publicly displayed now, we'd still be embarrassed.
Mm-hmm.
But that's just the Roman culture.
Right. Yeah. And so in that culture, you have this Christian.
And it may seem at first glance that verse 4, I mean, we've been talking about brotherly love, let brotherly love continue and show hospitality and remember those who are in prison. And then he talks about marriage, and it may seem like this is, I mean, he's just bouncing around these random topics. But if you want to apostatize, give in to sexual immorality. And we see that in our own culture. I mean, what are all these people who are deconstructing the faith? What are they deconstructing because of?
Right. Yeah.
That's because of homosexuality.
Uh-huh.
Like they just can't abide by the biblical teaching,
Right.
and traditional understanding of the text about homosexuality, and so they deconstruct, they apostatize.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to apostatize, give in to sexual immorality.
Right. Yeah.
And so this is not just a random teaching. He's still warning them in the context of persecution, in this culture where everywhere you look, there's immorality. And it would be really easy to just slide into that,
Uh-huh.
to let marriage be considered
Yeah.
a treasure, and let the marriage bed, which is, it's just a euphemism for the sexual relationship, let it be undefiled.
Right. Yeah. There's a lot of pathways to slide off into apostasy, and you can even see in Hebrews how he's addressed those, right? You've got persecution, but what does that bring? That brings discouragement. So discouragement is a major pathway, like out of the Christian faith into apostasy.
And that's why he tells them to remember those who are in prison,
Mm-hmm.
because they're going to be discouraged if they're just sitting in this dungeon by themselves and no one ever comes to bring them anything.
Yeah, and then you have the problem of evil and suffering,
Mm-hmm.
which if you are being persecuted, you're experiencing, and you can wonder, does God even care about you?
Yep.
And so what do you need there? You need brotherly love, you need the church,
Mm-hmm.
and then you have sexual immorality. And
Yep.
those are still today the three like major highways
Yeah.
to apostasy or deconstruction.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So it all fits perfectly
Mm-hmm.
there together.
Tom Schreiner, in his commentary, says one way to fall away from the faith is to give oneself over to sexual sin. We see that. I mean, again, this ties us back up to chapter 12, where he says that we need to be sure that there's no one who is sexually immoral or unholy like Esau,
Mm.
because that's the gateway. It's the gateway to falling away.
And the warning that God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterer. And the term in this text, is it the word porneia?
It's they're distinct. So there's porneia, sexually immoral,
Uh-huh.
and then there's adultery. So they're not synonymous. They're different,
Right.
but they fall under the category of not holding marriage to be
Mhm.
honored.
So, but this word for sexually immoral is a blanket term.
Yeah.
So a lot of people, they will, they'll interject and say all kinds of things. So he doesn't list homosexuality, right? But he
Right.
lists porneia,
Porneia, right.
which is a blanket term for
It's
any sexual activity outside of
marriage.
covenant marriage
Right.
between a man and a woman.
Right. Yeah.
That's
So
that's the biblical position.
Porneia, pornography,
Mhm.
right? Sex outside of marriage, fornication, homosexuality. Even in here would be like pedophilia,
Uh-huh.
any sexual relationship outside of the marriage relationship, and then adultery would be you're in the marriage, and anything that is either brought into the marriage or sex outside of that relationship.
Right. And it sounds like, George, that we've got more of a whisper here. Is that right?
It's a loud whisper.
Yeah. I like how you brought that up in your
Well,
sermon.
I wasn't going to, and I was just, as I was studying this, it just struck. I mean, how long ago did J.D. Greer say that? It's been a long
4 years?
It's been a long time.
Probably 4 years
It's
ago.
4 or 5, yeah. But as I was studying it, I just was struck again by how ludicrous that statement was. For him to say that was because he knew that there were people in his congregation
Right.
who are practicing these things,
Mm-hmm.
and he's watering it down.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a completely asinine thing to say. I didn't mean to say it yesterday, but it just kind of came out of just frustration
Mm.
over this idea that the Bible doesn't speak as loudly against sexual sin as it does against what
Greed.
was it greed?
I think it was
greed
love of money.
and it was greed, and he said something else. I can't remember what he said. Sexual immorality tops every list, every vice list in the New Testament. Sexual immorality is like right there at the top. If it's not the first thing, it's like the top 3.
Uh-huh.
And then I mean, 1 Corinthians 6, Ephesians 5, Colossians 3, 1 Thessalonians 4, Revelation 21. It's everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
I was just
And then Jesus, then Jesus has to
yeah,
amplify it and
Mhm.
say this really is a condition of the heart.
right.
Right. So he'll take it a step further
Yeah.
to say, well, you haven't actually physically engaged in this, but if you have lusted after a woman, you've committed adultery in your heart.
Right.
He amplifies it even greater. So it's almost like, George, it's a megaphone.
Yeah,
not a
It's not a
whisper.
whisper. It's deafening.
Right.
Because God will judge the sexually immoral and the adulterous.
Huh.
Honor marriage, keep the marriage bed undefiled, because God's going to judge those who are sexually immoral, and that's found in all these passages that I just cited. Like, the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God. The wrath of God is coming upon people who practice these things. The Lord is an avenger in all of these things. These people will be thrown into the lake of fire.
Yeah.
Like, it's serious. It's serious.
I think maybe one way churches can recapture this idea that the marriage bed is to be held in high honor is to maybe honor those people in your church that have been married for a long time.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So younger people should. We have this thing in our culture where we're obsessed with youth and we don't really honor our elders.
Mhm.
I'm not speaking about church elders here. I'm speaking about older people.
Right.
Older people that have been married a long time
Mm-hmm.
should be held in high honor
Definitely. Yeah, definitely.
because they've lived a whole life of this.
Right.
And so how churches can go about that,
Mm.
I'm not sure, but I think that's a pathway.
Yeah. Today's my anniversary,
Happy anniversary.
19 years. But I think about people that have been married 30, 40, 50 years.
Uh-huh.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, we should honor people that have been faithful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I mean, I listed several ways that we can honor marriage. The first is for married people to honor their marriage,
Uh-huh.
right? Protect their marriage. Don't let anything come into their marriage that would weaken it. For young people to flee from sexual sin. And then for our church as a whole
Which one way they can? What does Paul say? To flee sexual sin.
flee sexual
To get married.
get married. Yeah.
I mean, it's like sometimes it's just so obvious.
Yeah, like you're tempted to sexually get married. Yeah, get married. Yeah.
Practical Paul.
Yeah, don't live a celibate life. Like,
Yeah.
get married. And don't deprive each other.
Mm.
I preached through 1 Corinthians at Northwest, and that was a fun passage to preach through with all these 70 and 80-year-old people.
Yeah.
Like, don't deprive one another.
Well, it's not. I think back, 20 years, because kind of when you're in the leadership position in the military, you end up inevitably dealing with people in their marriages. So go back 20 years to everyone that I know that's had a bad marriage, is that they did not, they didn't have sex with their spouse. And so, like, it's a gift that God has given, but it's more than like the Christian marriage bed is more than what the world knows like sex to be, right? So it's a gift, and if you fail to exercise that gift with your spouse, then you are opening both of you up to danger, not only in this sphere,
right?
But it's like there's like a breachhead to where all kinds of other problems can happen in your marriage, because you're just not close.
Right.
You're just not close. Then eventually you just become like people living in the house with each other. You're like roommates. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that is a pattern that you can see. I'm sure you've seen it over 20 years that you've been doing
Definitely.
this. And
Yep.
but somehow there's this, I think in the Christian world, it's like a taboo to even talk about that.
I mean, it's not the there can be other problems. There can be, I mean, this isn't the cure all to every problem, but it is a big one. Like, it is a gift that God has given to the marriage relationship, so that you do cling to one another, right?
Right.
It's Christians have been called prudes, and I think there's probably some truth to that in the past. But the Bible speaks about sex in a pretty plain way. We don't have to be,
positive.
we don't have to be embarrassed. We don't have to be
Right.
embarrassed about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
We don't have to be Mark Driscoll and be crass.
Right.
He years ago, him and his wife did like a Q&A. He's teaching through Song of Solomon, and they did like a Q&A, and Julia and I tried to listen to it, and we got maybe 2 in, and we're like, this is too, this is overboard.
Right.
And then at the same time, John MacArthur, he was warning against Driscoll.
Yeah, and he wrote him a few letters, I think, at that time.
And he said, the Song of Solomon is veiled in poetic language for a reason.
Right. So what? So don't unveil it.
Yeah.
There's no reason to.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you see that? Did I send you that clip of him screaming at everybody?
Which
the famous famous one where he's screaming at all the men at the church.
How dare you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And somebody said it to heavy metal. Did I send it to you?
I don't know if you did or not.
I'm gonna find it.
Okay.
It's gonna make an appearance on the podcast soon.
That's funny.
Yeah.
We should honor marriage, but the way that the church can do this is we need to speak out against the sexual immorality of the culture. Like we don't need to be embarrassed to call out these particular sins by name.
Mm-hmm.
Like homosexuality it's a sin against God. It wrecks the picture of marriage. Marriage is supposed to be a picture of Christ in the church, and homosexuality, it destroys
Right.
that picture. Transgenderism, we need to speak out against it instead of um, like cushioning our words. We need to call it out. We need to call it out as a sin, and we need to call out the things that we have already kind of caved to the culture, like sex outside of marriage
Right.
and pornography
Mhm.
and divorce. I mean, do you ever hear any Christians calling out divorce? We just It's just part of the culture,
Mm-hmm.
and we just kind of, well, it just is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, sometimes it is necessary. Um, there are biblical reasons for divorce, but I think that we just kind of accept it as just part of the culture.
Mm-hmm.
Like, as a church, we need to stand on what the Bible teaches and honor marriage. And I mean, we've seen it. We've seen it in the church just in the last decade of how quickly the church can cave into these things. It's wild.
It really
It's
is.
wild, and it should be a wake up call for us. Like, we can't just think the culture is going to get better.
Mm-hmm.
We need to teach our kids the biblical ethics of sex, and we need to boldly call it out, and call the culture to repent.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to stand for these things that are true, because we're not always going to be here,
Right.
and it doesn't even take a generation for the church to fall away.
Right. Yeah.
It can take place within a decade,
Mm-hmm. Right.
and you've got churches that are they're allies, and they take pride. I mean, we've got the Sparkle Creed, being talked about, and I mean, you've got clergy that are wearing the rainbow colors, and this is all taking place very, very quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. Isn't it interesting that like sexual immorality is the only protected? It's like only protected sin. All the other sins, like that Jesus would teach against or the apostles teach against, people still want to be on board with those. Greed,
Yeah.
anger, drunkenness. You list them; those are still taboos,
Right.
but not that. It's like a protected class of sin
Yeah. Right.
that must be accepted.
Yeah.
Or you're not loving.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's where we're at. So love marriage in a hostile culture, and that makes Christianity unique, as it did then. It still can do today. But also you have to love contentment, and this one really ties back into the other one.
Mm-hmm.
So covetousness is not only the root of a whole variety of sins, but it's also at the root of sexual sin, because you're not content.
The grammar matches also. The imperative is also missing. It has to be supplied in this verse also, so
Right.
they're tied together.
Right. Yeah.
And sexual immorality and coveting are often paired elsewhere. We can see that in Ephesians
So
chapter 5.
He says it this way: keep your life free from the love of money, and be content with what you have.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a negative, and then there's a positive. So keep your life free of love of money and be content. And that really is the hard issue, contentment. If you are discontent with your marriage or your singleness, you're going to be tempted to sexual immorality. Like, you're not content with the wife that God has given to you, and so you're going to look elsewhere. You're not content with your singleness, and so you're going to try to seek a relationship outside of God's will. You aren't content with how much money you have. You're going to be greedy for more,
Right.
but more is never going to be enough.
Yeah. We see this all throughout our culture, right? It doesn't matter how much you get, how much you get financially, materially, houses, exotic vacations. Like the rich and famous are miserable people. Like we have access to the rich and famous because of media,
Mm,
and they are just as miserable as everybody else.
right.
You know, so that
Yeah.
should. I mean, even though we have that as
Mm,
a living testimony to us,
right.
people still fall into this trap.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is that they're never content,
Right.
and it's because they're not content in Christ,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so you can't fill that void with other things
Mm,
because the hole's never filled up.
right.
You just get where you thought you would be content and realize I'm just as unhappy and miserable as I was before.
Yep. Yeah.
But even though we see that, it's an easy trap for people to fall into.
Mm. This would have been again very pertinent for these Christians. We go back to chapter 10, and we're reminded that they have in the past experienced the plundering of their property. Now that persecution is starting up again, they might be thinking, "Am I going to lose everything? Am I going to, am I going to lose my stuff? Am I going to lose my house?"
Yeah.
And so it's easy to see how they would be tempted to fall away in order to keep their stuff, to keep their property, to keep their money, right?
Yeah.
Offer a pinch of incense to Caesar, and we'll leave you alone.
Mm-hmm.
Don't, and everything you have could be forfeit. And we see this. This danger warned against all over the place. Jesus, he gives the parable of the four soils, and you have the one seed that falls on thorny ground and it grows up, and the thorns choke out the life. What's the interpretation? It's because of the cares of the world,
Right.
and the riches,
Mm-hmm.
the deceitfulness of riches. Demas falls away from Paul because he's in love with this present world.
Mm-hmm.
Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 6, he warns against the love of money because by loving money, many people have plunged into ruin and destruction. They've fallen away because they love money.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the same warning. Keep your life free of the love of money, because if you love money, if you make money your God, if you make money your hope, you're going to fall away.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to fall away.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. The last one is love of Jesus. You stated this summarizes the first five. So explain how, and wrap this up for us as we close. How does this tie it all together?
All right. So there is debate. Verse 6 could just be tied in with verse 5, or it could be referencing back to the whole thing. But as one commentator put it, even if you say that grammatically it's just tied to verse 5, thematically it's tied to all of these verses. So in the midst of a hostile culture that's persecuting Christians, love the brotherhood, love the brethren, love strangers and show hospitality, love those who are persecuted, love marriage, keep your life free from love of money, be content. So we can confidently say, "The Lord is my helper. I shall not fear. What can man do to me?" Like we're set free from fear. We don't have to fear what's going to happen if the government finds out that we're Christians. We don't have to fear what's going to happen when our sexual ethic is ridiculed by the culture. we don't have to fear what's going to happen if our property is plundered, because the Lord is our helper. We don't have to fear. That's a quote from Psalm 118.
Mm-hmm.
And if you go back and read Psalm 118, it's this great psalm that is just speaking of confidence in God. And so we don't have to be afraid to live this way because God is with us. And again, this ties us into the entire book. If everything that has been said about Christ is true in the first 12 chapters, then we can say this with confidence in verse 6. And what's interesting about verse 6 is that the argument of the entire book of Hebrews has been that God is speaking to you. So he's speaking through his son. We go back to chapter 1, verse 1. Long ago, many times, in many ways, God spoke to us through the prophets. But in these last days, he's spoken to us through his son. And then he just starts giving all of these references in the Old Testament. Like, God is speaking to you through his son. And then the end of 12, the warning is, don't refuse him who is speaking to you. And then verse 6 of chapter 13 is the first time where we are responding. Mm. And so if everything that's been said in chapters 1 through 12 is true about Jesus, about how he's superior to the angels and Moses and Joshua and the high priest, and he's the mediator of a new covenant, and he's made this once for all sacrifice, what can we say in response? We can say, I'm not afraid of what man's going to do to me because God is with me. The Lord is my helper. I won't be afraid. What can man do to me? And that's where we should land. We can't divorce chapter 13 from the rest of the book just because these are now like these general application.
Uh-huh.
Like, this is the answer to all of the theology. This is our response. God has done this. How are you going to respond to what God has done for you in Christ? Mm. Well, you're going to offer acceptable sacrifices to him. You're going to offer acceptable service to him by loving and not being afraid. Don't be afraid of what the culture is going to do because God is with you.
Awesome. So. Yeah. Good stuff, George. All right. Well, thanks for listening today. Hopefully this has been helpful and beneficial to you, and you've learned more about Hebrews and how the book fits together. And more importantly, what God expects of us, those of us who say we are Christians. How are we to live in a culture? We can see that these truths which were applied 2,000 years ago are just as relevant for our lives today. And we need to apply them to our lives so that we can be faithful to live as Christians in a hostile culture. This has been helpful to you. Please give us a like, subscribe, share. You can write us a review. We'd appreciate that. As always, we hope that this has helped you to be more conformed to Christ. We'll see you next time.